Ecclesiastes chapter 6. A little bit of a shorter chapter. Chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men, a man to whom God hath given riches, wealth, and honor, so that he wanteth nothing for his soul of all that he desireth. And yet God giveth him not power to eat thereof, but a stranger eateth it. This is vanity, and it is an evil disease. If a man beget 100 children, and live many years, so that the days of his life be many, and his soul be not filled with good, and also that he have no burial, I say that an untimely birth is better than he. For he cometh in with vanity, and departeth in darkness, and his name shall be covered with darkness. Moreover, he hath not seen the sun, nor known anything. This hath more rest than the other. Yea, though he live 1,000 years twice told, yet hath he seen no good. Do not all go to one place? All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not filled. For what hath the wise more than the fool? What hath the poor that knoweth to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit." And then he closes with this. He says, "That which hath been named already, and it is known that it is man, neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he. Seeing there be many things that increase vanity, what is man the better? For who knoweth what is good for man in this life? All the days of his vain life, which he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun?" Now, the end of chapter 5, and I know it's been, by this point, several weeks since we looked at this, but the end of chapter 5 ended with this realization, and just quickly from verse 18 of chapter 5, "Behold, that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor." And so the end of chapter 5 ends with this realization that man should enjoy the fruit of his labor because not because it's something that he produced, not because it's a vanity thing, but because it is a gift of God. God gave you a job, God has provided, and thus it is good for you to enjoy the fruits of that labor. But not only is the fruit itself a gift, but the enjoyment of the fruit is a gift as well. And so not the fact that you get fruit from your labor, but the fact that you can enjoy that fruit, that in and of itself is a gift from God. And so thus Solomon relents those to whom God has given lavish gifts and yet are unable to enjoy them. And he'll give some examples here in just a second. And so, Solomon, as we've talked about, he's older and he's wiser, but he's been through a lot of things in his life. And so he's gone on this kind of quest, you might say, to figure out life. And for his quest, for his experiment, a lot of people use that word with regards to Ecclesiastes. For his experiment, he's kind of looking at the world through the lens of how most in the world would view it, that being the secular lens, the one without God. And so as he's looking around the world, he sees people who have nothing, and then on the other side, he sees people who have everything that they could ever want, but for one reason or another just simply can't enjoy it. Either they, to liken this to kind of what we see sometimes as a modern problem, is you have people who throw themselves at their job, and they're working, 100-plus hour a week, and maybe they have raised the ladder, maybe they're making a solid paycheck, and maybe they've even, busted into the stratosphere of millionaire, but at the end of the day, their family hardly knows them. They're terrible to be around. They're not joyful people. And so at the end of the day, Solomon's looking at, somebody like that who has everything, but ultimately, and more importantly, doesn't really have anything, if you kind of understand what I mean by that. And so Solomon, he talks about that, not only the fruit of our labor is a gift, but the enjoyment of that fruit is also a gift. And so it's a different way to look at it. But he doesn't just consider those gifts which are monetary in nature, not just money, but those are the tangible gifts, other tangible gifts. And he gives two specific examples, and that being children, and that being a long life, longevity. And so he says in verse 3, it says, "If a man beget 100 children, and live many years, so the days of his years be many, and his soul be not filled with good, and also that he have no burial, I say that an untimely birth is better than he." And then verse 6, "Yea, though he live 1,000 years twice told, yet hath seen no good, do not all go to one place." And so he gives these two tangible gifts of God, children, long life. And in fact, these two are kind of seen consistently throughout the Old Testament as gifts of God. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Israelites were commanded to keep the law of Moses. And then it says this, thou and thy son and thy son's sons. It says all the days of thy life. And then it says this, and that thy days may be prolonged. And so God essentially tells them, with obedience, I will grant you this gift of longevity. You know, as you follow my laws, there will be long life. Psalm 127, verse 3, lo, children are an inheritance of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. And so consistently we see both the gift of children, the gift of longevity being these things that are God-given, and they are to be enjoyed. And so those who have a lot of children, or those who have a lot of money, those who have lived to a good old age, whatever the case may be, if they have those gifts and yet have not lived to such a degree that they have enjoyed those gifts, it's as if they have squandered that which God has given them. And so Solomon is looking at this, and again, through the lens of secularism, and he's looking at this and saying, what's the point? What's the point of it all? Why would anybody be given these things and not enjoy them? It seems like a waste. And so there are those who have all the best that, again, quote-unquote, life can offer, and yet still, as Solomon says, his soul be not filled with good, and also that he have no burial. And that means a whole lot more in this particular culture than what we might consider it. But this person may outwardly look like they have it all, but inwardly they are unfulfilled, and ultimately they go to the grave without having even been grieved. And that is the ultimate, you might say, shame. Right, to go to your grave, and either there's nobody there at your funeral, or the ones who are there don't really care. This is an ultimate shame. Solomon, in fact, he goes so far, and at the end of verse 3, he goes so far to say this, an untimely birth is better than he. These are strong words. Michael Eaton, he says it this way, to die unburied was the mark of a despised and unmourned end. Better to miscarry at birth than to miscarry throughout life. And so Solomon actually says this at the end of verse 3. I say that an untimely birth is better. It would be better for that individual had they just died at birth, if they had just been miscarried. Again, very, very strong language. And so as I was thinking through this, again, with the book of Ecclesiastes, it's difficult when you lose sight of under the sun, when you forget under the sun. And so it all just seems so fatalistic. It all seems so fatalistic until you remember Solomon is writing from the secular perspective. And this is a very, very important outlook and a very important biblical truth. And let me read this quote, and I want to say just something about it. Derek Kidner, he said, if this life is all, and offer to some people frustration rather than fulfillment, leaving them nothing to pass on to those who depend on them, if further, all alike are waiting their turn to be deleted, as it says in verse 6, which says, yea, though he lived to be 1,000 years twice told, yet hath no good, do not all go to one place. That's kind of what he's referencing there. Then some indeed can envy the stillborn, whose turn comes first. Job and Jeremiah at times would have fervently agreed. And if we disagree with that mood of these two men, and here's the key, if we disagree with that mood of these two men, it is because we judge their lives by values that transcend death and outweigh a lifetime's pains and pleasures, criteria that the secularist cannot logically use. Now here's what he means by that. When a Christian looks at the world, and a Christian sees tragedy, a Christian sees heartache, trial, temptation, all of these things that we would consider to be objectively negative, objectively bad, evil things, the Christian can look at that and they can say with an objective standard that is wrong. That is not how it should be, right? God has a plan and a purpose. You are made in his image. We are made for better things than that. The secularist, the person who is living outside of the purview of not outside of the purview of God, but they think they are because they think there is no God, they look at that. They have no objective moral standard to say that's wrong. What can they stand upon to say death and heartache and tragedy, that those things are wrong? What does the secularist, what leg do they have to stand on to look at to go to a funeral and have somebody who has died and about to be put in the grave with not a single person to mourn for them? What objectively can they stand upon to say that ought not to be? Because to the secularists, we're just organized matter, right? I mean, all we are is just protoplasm that has made it farther than other protoplasm, right? We're just a bunch of group of cells, and we've gotten together and we've done some good things, but ultimately there's no morality. There's no objective standard for morality. And so it all seems so fatalistic because we understand that we were made in the image of God. It's because we understand that there is a God. And because there is a God, there is an objective moral standard. The only reason we can say these things are bad and ought not to be is because we have the objective standard of God that shows us what is good and what should be. And so this is why Solomon can write from this perspective and say things like this that seem fatalistic, because we're coming from the opposite standard. We're coming from the side of God and his morality, not the side of the world, its quote-unquote morality, even though that doesn't really exist. And so this is why, you read through Ecclesiastes, and it can be difficult. It can be really hard to get through this book, and you might think, well, man, it's just such a downer. And it seems that way because it's intended to be that way, because it shows you this is the world outside of God. This is what the world is outside of God. And so you have to keep that perspective, and you have to constantly come back to that, particularly when you see that phrase, under the sun, because it is all throughout the book. And so that's an important perspective to have for the whole book, not just chapter 6, but for the whole book. And so Solomon then presents in verse 7 another aspect of this, kind of what we would refer to as the rat race. That's kind of the best way I knew to explain this. Verse 7, all the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not filled. For what hath the wise more than the fool, and what hath the poor that knoweth to walk better than the living? Better is the sight of the eyes and the wandering of the desire. This also a vanity and vexation of spirit. And so what I said, he's referring to what we might call the rat race. Essentially, we work to eat so that we have the strength to continue working so that we can keep eating. Right? It's just this almost a cyclical nature. In this sense, Solomon asked the question, is the wise man really better than the poor? Because at the end of the day, the wise man has to work to eat so he can keep working, just as the poor man has to work to eat so he can keep working. Right? At the end of the day, which one is really ultimately better? And so he asks, in a world where wisdom is not putting food on the table, it's better to see than to desire. Right? It ultimately doesn't matter. What matters is the food on the table. And so again, under the sun, right? He's thinking about this under the sun. And so, yes, wisdom is ultimately a good thing. But he's also talking about things from a secularist perspective. And so verse 10, he ends with, as I said a while ago, he ends with this, that which hath been is named already. I like that phrase. That which hath been is named already, and it is known that it is man. Neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he. And so he ends with another look at essentially God's sovereignty. And he does have little glimpses every now and then of this. So everything that is has already been named and known by God. Everything that is has already been named and known by God. This is essentially a way to say that God is its creator. And so God has created and is sovereign over all, and that includes man. And as he says, man cannot contend with him that is mightier than he. And so at the end of the day, right, if we're reading through the book of Ecclesiastes and we think, well, I don't like this. Well, who are we to contend with God? Who are we to contend with his word? Now, why this is true, it does not stop men from trying. But I like Isaiah is kind of the ultimate text for this idea. Isaiah says it this way, woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, what makest thou? Or thy work he hath no hands. In other words, you're the pot, and if you're a pot, that indicates that there was the maker of the pot, right? There was the potsherds, and he says the maker. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth, who makest thou? And so, in other words, if we're going to contend with somebody, contend with pots. Don't contend with the master maker. Right? You have no word over him. You have no authority over him. Arguing with God will never help. And so Solomon says, what is man the better? And then the chapter closes with a few unanswerable questions. And it's an interesting end in verses 11 and 12. Unanswerable questions. And again, I want to remind you from the under the sun perspective. And so man sees the world, and not only the world, but his own life, inexorably coming to an unstoppable end. In other words, every person who's ever lived, if they're honest with themselves, they know that they're not going to live forever. Now, it's funny that I just saw a couple of days ago, and I don't know when this happened, but I just saw this a couple of days ago. Kenneth Copeland actually says that he has made a covenant with God that he's going to live another 50 years. And he's already, I don't know, like 90 years old. But he says he's made a covenant with God. He's going to keep on going. Well, we'll see how that works out for him. But nevertheless, most people understand that their life is coming to an unstoppable end. This leads to two questions. The first stemming from the second. Number one, what is good for man in this life? And number two, what shall be after him under the sun? Right? Under the sun. These are the questions that every secularist needs to ask. These are the questions that every atheist, every agnostic, these are the questions that they need to ask. What is good for man in this life? Well, again, I go back to what I said earlier. That you have no standard for good. You can't even make the claim that there is good in a world where God doesn't exist. Why do we know that there is good? We know that there is good because we have a holy standard that shows us what is good and what is not good. And so they need to ask this question. They need to ask the question, what shall be after him? And I think they probably do have these questions, but ultimately they try to answer it with science. They try to answer it with philosophy. They try to understand it with, logical wisdom. But all of that is earthly in fashion. And yet at the end of the day, we have to go outside of that. We have to go over the sun to see the Creator, to see what the Creator says about the end. And so, again, Solomon, and he tells us here at the end of verse 12, what shall be after him under the sun? Well, they have no answer. They have nothing to offer. And so under the sun, there is no answer. There is not even a possibility of an after. And so this is, like I said, this chapter 6, if you don't understand Solomon's perspective and why he's writing, it does carry with it this defeatist ideology. And you might... there's a reason why so many people read the book of Ecclesiastes and they make the claim that it is in nature pessimistic. I understand why people think that, but that's because they misunderstand what Solomon's doing. They don't understand the purposes of his writing. They don't understand that this was coming from a man who has lived in a variety of ways, you might say. He's lived in accordance to the law, and then because of bad relationships that he never should have made with 700 different women, he was drawn away from God, and he lived at least for a brief amount of time. We don't know how long, but he lived at least for a brief amount of time. I would suggest probably a lot longer, in at least a secularist mindset. And so he's lived both worlds. He's seen it, and of course he's seen it all with his amount of wisdom that was given to him by God, and it leads him to these questions. And like I said, they're good questions to ask. But when you have the secularist position, there is no answer for them. There is not an answer. The answer only comes when you understand that there is not just an under the sun, but there's a great, vast, ultimate, eternal beyond. And that's what you have to keep in mind as you read through the book of Ecclesiastes. So more interesting things, the book is I would use the term very philosophical in nature. And so that's kind of what gives it its difficulties. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm trying to play one, as we go through this book, and it's difficult at times, but it's been a real joy to get into it because it's a book that, like I said, a lot of people have never studied. It's a book that I've never spent any significant time studying prior to this. So hopefully you're getting something out of it. I know I have been. So any